The thunder of heavy rain against the asphalt was drowned out by the sudden, deafening roar of 93 Harley-Davidson engines firing to life in perfect unison. They weren't riding for a rally or a turf war. They were riding because a barefoot 5-year-old girl had just stumbled into their bar, trembling, with a terrifying secret. The town of Blackwood, Oregon, was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, left their back doors unlocked, and trusted the quiet rhythm of suburban life. For Sarah Harper, a 28-year-old single mother working double shifts at the local diner, Blackwood was a sanctuary. After a messy divorce, she had moved her 8-year-old son, Tommy, and 5-year-old daughter, Lily, into a small, drafty, but affordable 2-story house at the dead end of Sycamore Drive. Things had finally started looking up when Sarah met Richard Gable. Rick was a local contractor, charming, handy, and seemingly devoted to Sarah and the kids. He fixed the leaky roof, brought groceries on Sundays, and always had a warm smile. But behind closed doors, when Sarah was away working the graveyard shift, the smile faded. Rick had a temper, a cold, simmering rage that Tommy, with the sharp intuition of an older brother, had noticed immediately. Tommy had tried to warn his mother, but Rick's manipulation was masterful. He convinced Sarah that Tommy was just acting out, struggling with the absence of his biological father. The nightmare began on a freezing Tuesday night in mid-November. Sarah had kissed her children goodbye at 10 p.m., pulling her uniform coat tight against the biting wind as she headed to her shift. Rick had offered to watch them, sitting in the living room recliner with a beer in hand, the television glowing with a muted football game. Upstairs, Lily was fast asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit, but Tommy was awake. He never slept when Rick was in the house. Around 11:30 p.m., a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Lily startled awake, her heart pounding against her small ribs. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet padding silently against the worn hardwood floor. She crept to the top of the stairs and peered through the wooden banister. The scene below paralyzed her. The heavy oak coffee table was overturned. Tommy was on the floor, his lip bleeding, frantically scrambling backward towards the hallway. Rick was towering over him, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "I told you to keep your mouth shut, you little brat," Rick hissed, his voice a terrifying, raspy whisper. He grabbed Tommy by the collar of his pajama shirt, lifting the 60-pound boy off the ground with sickening ease. "Leave my mum alone. I'm going to tell her about the money," Tommy screamed, thrashing wildly, his small fists connecting with Rick's chest. Lily clamped her hands over her mouth to muffle a scream. She didn't understand what money they were talking about, but she understood the violence. Rick didn't just hit Tommy, he systematically overpowered him. From her vantage point, Lily watched in frozen horror as Rick pulled a roll of thick silver duct tape and a coil of heavy nylon rope from his contractor's tool belt, items he had brought into the house intentionally. This wasn't a sudden loss of temper. This was planned. Tommy fought like a cornered animal, kicking and biting, but he was no match for a full-grown man. Within minutes, Rick had forced the boy onto his stomach, wrapping the rough nylon rope brutally tight around Tommy's wrists and ankles, hog-tying him. He slapped a piece of duct tape across the boy's mouth, cutting off his panicked cries. "Now," Rick panted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're going to stay down there until I figure out what to do with you. And if your sister wakes up, I'll put her down there with you." Rick grabbed the rope binding Tommy's ankles and dragged the struggling boy across the kitchen linoleum. He opened the heavy wooden door leading to the unfinished basement. The basement was a damp, pitch-black space Sarah used only for storage, plagued by a faulty light switch and a heavy, rusted padlock on the outside, installed years ago by a previous owner. Rick dragged Tommy down the wooden stairs. The sickening thud, thud, thud of her brother's body hitting the steps echoed in Lily's ears. A moment later, Rick marched back up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and snapped the heavy padlock into place. Lily couldn't breathe. She knew Rick would come upstairs to check on her next. Panic, primal and sharp, flooded her 5-year-old brain. She ran back into her bedroom, but she knew hiding under the bed wasn't enough. The monster was in the house. She had to get help. She rushed into the small adjoining bathroom, climbing onto the edge of the porcelain bathtub. Above the tub was a small, rectangular window that pushed outward. It was a tight squeeze, even for her tiny frame. She pushed the glass open, the freezing November rain immediately lashing across her face. Below was the sloped roof of the back porch, leading down to the muddy backyard. Hearing Rick's heavy footsteps groaning on the staircase, Lily didn't hesitate. She squeezed her shoulders through the narrow opening, scraping her sides against the metal frame, and tumbled out into the stormy night just as the bathroom door swung open. The rain was relentless, a freezing downpour that soaked through Lily's thin cotton nightgown in seconds. She slid down the porch roof, landing hard in the mud below, scraping her knees. She didn't cry. The terror had pushed her past tears. All she could see in her mind was Tommy, bound and gagged in the terrifying darkness of the basement. She ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from Sycamore Drive. She scrambled through the wet brush of the neighbor's yard, her bare feet sinking into the freezing mud, stepping on sharp twigs and rocks that cut her soles. Blackwood was practically shut down at this hour. The streetlights flickered in the storm, casting long, eerie shadows. Lily wandered for what felt like hours, shivering violently, her lips turning a faint shade of blue. Vehicles occasionally sped past on the main road, but they couldn't see the tiny figure in the darkness, and Lily was too terrified to wave them down, afraid it might be Rick looking for her. Eventually, the residential streets gave way to the industrial edge of town. Here, nestled between an abandoned lumber yard and a 24-hour gas station, sat the Iron Horse Saloon. It wasn't a family establishment. The parking lot was packed shoulder to shoulder with heavily modified, gleaming motorcycles. This was the local clubhouse for the Steel Brotherhood, a notorious motorcycle club. They were big, heavily tattooed men in leather cuts, known for their intimidating presence, loud engines, and a fiercely guarded brotherhood. To the town, they were roughnecks. To a 5-year-old girl in the dead of night, they were monsters of a different kind. But Lily was desperate, freezing to death, and completely out of options. The neon sign of the bar flickered a warm, inviting red. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and damp leather. Classic rock blared from a jukebox in the corner. Big Mike. Henderson, the president of the Steel Brotherhood, was sitting at the head of a long wooden table. Mike was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4", with a thick grey beard, arms covered in faded prison ink, and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He was mid-laugh, telling a story to his vice president, a wiry man known as Sully, when the heavy wooden front door of the bar creaked open. The wind howled into the room, cutting through the heavy air. At first, nobody noticed. Then, Sully squinted toward the entrance. "Hey, close the damn door!" he barked. No one moved to close it, because standing in the doorway, illuminated by the harsh overhead light of the porch, was a ghost. Lily stood trembling violently, her pink nightgown plastered to her skin, completely coated in mud and blood from her scraped knees and feet. Her hair was matted to her face, and her wide, terrified eyes scanned the room full of giant, intimidating men. The music suddenly seemed too loud. Big Mike stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. The entire bar, nearly 100 bikers, fell dead silent. The contrast was jarring, a room full of hardened outlaws staring at a broken, freezing child. "Holy hell," muttered Doc, the club's resident mechanic and former army medic, immediately dropping his pool cue. Big Mike didn't run. He walked slowly, deliberately, dropping to one knee a few feet away from the girl so he wouldn't tower over her. Up close, he could see her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. He immediately unzipped his heavy, fur-lined leather jacket and wrapped it around her tiny shoulders. It swallowed her completely. "Hey there, little bird," Mike said, his voice surprisingly deep and gentle, a stark contrast to his fearsome appearance. "Where's your mama? Who did this to you?" Lily gripped the edges of the leather jacket. She looked into Mike's eyes. They were weathered and tough, but they weren't cruel like Rick's. She took a shaky breath, her tiny chest heaving. "He tied up my brother," she sobbed, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the room. "He tied up my brother and locked him in the basement." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mike's jaw tightened. "Who did, sweetheart? Who tied him up?" "Rick," she cried, burying her face into the massive leather sleeve of Mike's jacket. "He had tape. He put it on Tommy's mouth. Please. He's in the dark. He's going to hurt him." Mike didn't ask another question. He didn't ask for a last name, and he didn't call the police. He stood up, lifting Lily effortlessly into his arms, holding her safely against his chest. He turned to face the room. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, dangerous rumble of 93 men shifting on their feet. There was no discussion needed. The code of the Brotherhood was simple. You do not touch women, and you never touch children. "Doc," Mike barked. "Get her in the back. Get her warm, clean those cuts, and keep her safe. Do not leave her side." Doc nodded, stepping forward and gently taking the bundled girl from Mike. "I got her, boss." Mike turned to Sully, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Sully, get the address out of her." Gently. Within 60 seconds, Sully emerged from the back room. "Sycamore Drive, dead end, house with the blue shutters." Mike walked behind the bar and grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from beneath the register, slapping it into his palm. He looked out at his men, 93 bikers, all staring back at him, their expressions universally hardened into masks of righteous fury. They reached for heavy flashlights, chains, and tire irons. "Mount up," Mike growled. The exodus was instantaneous. 93 men poured out of the saloon into the freezing rain. Kickstands were kicked up in a massive metallic wave. Ignitions turned. And then the roar. 93 heavy V-twin engines exploded to life, vibrating the pavement, shaking the rain from the awnings. It was a terrifying, beautiful sound. It was the sound of consequences. Mike kicked his bike into gear, leading the massive wedge of steel and leather out of the parking lot. They didn't obey speed limits. They didn't stop at red lights. They tore through the sleeping streets of Blackwood like a mechanized thunderstorm, a tidal wave of chrome and headlights cutting through the darkness, heading straight for Sycamore Drive. Back at the house, Rick Gable had just cracked open a fresh beer. He was sitting on the couch, entirely oblivious to the fact that his time had just run out. He thought he was perfectly safe, a wolf in his own den. He didn't know that an entire pack of wolves was currently turning down his street, their headlights illuminating the blue shutters of the house, preparing to tear his world apart. The vibration hit the floorboards before the sound even reached the house. Rick Gable, slouched in Sarah's floral-patterned recliner, felt the half-empty beer bottle in his hand begin to tremble. He frowned, muted the television, and sat forward. A low, rhythmic thunder was rolling through the sleepy Blackwood neighborhood. It sounded like a freight train had somehow jumped the tracks and was barreling down the residential street. Then came the lights. A blinding, synchronized wave of high beams swept across the living room walls, illuminating the dust motes in the air and casting long, erratic shadows. The roar of the engines grew deafening, an overwhelming wall of sound that rattled the picture frames on the mantel and made the glass in the front windows vibrate dangerously. Rick stood up, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He moved to the window, pulling back the edge of the cheap vinyl blind. His stomach dropped. The entire street, from the dead-end cul-de-sac all the way back to the main intersection, was choked with chrome, black leather, and glaring headlights. Dozens upon dozens of heavy motorcycles had surrounded the property. They were parked on the lawn, blocking the driveway, and idling on the sidewalks. The engines cut off in a staggered, rolling wave, leaving a sudden, terrifying silence, broken only by the heavy downpour of the November rain and the hiss of cooling exhaust pipes. Through the rain-streaked glass, Rick watched as nearly 100 massive men dismounted. They moved with military precision, wordless and purposeful. A giant of a man with a grey beard and a heavy leather jacket stepped to the front of the pack. In his right hand, he carried a solid steel crowbar. Panic, icy and sharp, finally pierced Rick's arrogant facade. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. Who were they? How did they know? He glanced toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. The girl, he realized with a sickening jolt. She wasn't in her room. Before he could even turn to run toward the back door, the front porch groaned under heavy boots. Crack. The solid wood of the front door splintered as a size 14 steel-toed boot connected with the deadbolt. The doorframe shattered, sending shards of wood flying across the entryway rug. The door flew open, rebounding hard against the interior wall. Big Mike stepped over the threshold, the freezing wind and rain swirling in behind him. Flanking him was Sully, gripping a heavy maglite flashlight, and half a dozen other bikers, their faces hardened into expressions of absolute, chilling resolve. Rick scrambled backward, knocking over a side table. Hey, you can't be in here! I'm calling the cops!" he stammered, his voice cracking, the tough guy persona evaporating instantly. "Do it!" Mike growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Call them. Tell them what's in the basement." Rick froze, his eyes darting frantically toward the kitchen. It was the only confirmation the bikers needed. "Secure him," Mike ordered, barely looking at Rick. 3 bikers lunged forward. Rick tried to swing a wild punch, but a heavily tattooed biker named Bear caught his wrist mid-air, twisting it backward with a sickening pop. Rick screamed as he was slammed face first onto the living room floor, a heavy knee driving into his spine, pinning him to the carpet. Mike didn't wait to watch the struggle. He strode through the living room, his heavy boots leaving muddy tracks on the linoleum as he entered the kitchen. He saw the overturned coffee table, the scuff marks on the floor, and then the heavy wooden door with the rusted padlock. Mike jammed the wedge of the steel crowbar into the gap between the padlock and the hasp. With a single, brutal heave of his massive shoulders, the rusted metal shrieked and snapped. The lock clattered uselessly to the floor. He ripped the door open. The smell of damp earth and mold drifted up from the pitch-black stairwell. "Sully, light!" Mike barked. Sully stepped up, shining the heavy maglite down the stairs. The powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty concrete floor below. There, huddled in the farthest corner behind a stack of cardboard boxes, was Tommy. The 8-year-old boy was shaking violently. His wrists and ankles were bound tight with rough nylon rope, the skin around them chafed and bleeding. A thick strip of silver duct tape was plastered across his mouth. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it made Mike's chest ache. The boy thought the men breaking in were Rick's friends, coming to finish the job. Mike handed the crowbar to Sully and descended the stairs slowly, holding his hands out in front of him, palms open. "Hey, buddy," Mike said gently, softening his deep voice as much as possible. "It's okay. My name is Mike. Your sister, Lily, she sent me. She's safe, Tommy. She's safe and warm." At the sound of his sister's name, the rigid terror in Tommy's eyes broke, replaced by welling tears. Mike knelt beside the boy, pulling a small, razor-sharp pocket knife from his vest. "I'm gonna get this tape off first, okay? It might sting a little, but I'll be quick." Tommy nodded frantically. Mike grabbed the edge of the duct tape and peeled it back as swiftly and gently as he could. Tommy gasped, taking a massive gulp of air, his chest heaving as he began to sob. "It's okay, son. I got you," Mike murmured, using the blade to slice through the thick nylon ropes, binding the boy's wrists and ankles. The moment his hands were free, Tommy didn't rub his chafed wrists. He threw his arms around Mike's thick neck, burying his face in the man's leather vest, crying with the uninhibited desperation of a child who had thought he was going to die in the dark. Mike wrapped his massive arms around the boy, lifting him up effortlessly. "Let's get you out of this damp hole." When Mike carried Tommy up the stairs and into the kitchen, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Rick was still pinned to the floor in the living room, bleeding from a cut on his cheek, completely surrounded by towering men in leather. Tommy tightened his grip on Mike's neck as they walked past Rick. "Look at the floor, scum!" Bear growled at Rick, shoving the man's face back into the carpet, so he couldn't even make eye contact with the boy he had tortured. "Sully," Mike said, his voice cold again. "Take the boy out to the support truck. Turn the heat on blast. Doc is on his way with the girl." As Sully escorted Tommy out the front door, wrapped in a dry flannel shirt, Mike turned his attention back to Rick. But before Mike could decide how much frontier justice to dispense, another biker, a former locksmith known as Keys, walked out of the master bedroom holding a heavy black canvas duffel bag. Keys tossed it onto the floor next to Rick's head. The bag landed with a heavy metallic clink. "Found this shoved up in the air vent in the bedroom," Keys said, his brow furrowed. "He wasn't just hiding from the kid, boss. He was hiding this." Mike knelt, unzipping the heavy canvas bag. The twist of the night tumbled out onto the floor. It wasn't tools, it wasn't clothes. It was dozens of tightly banded stacks of $100 bills, 4 different burner cell phones, a loaded 9mm Glock, and a passport. Mike picked up the passport and flipped it open. The photo was undeniably Rick Gable, but the name printed beside it was Richard Kellerman. Mike looked down at the bleeding, pathetic man on the floor. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together. This wasn't just a domestic abuser. Rick wasn't a local contractor who had fallen for a single mum. He was a fugitive using Sarah's isolated dead-end house and her trusting nature as a blind front to hide cash and lay low. Tommy hadn't just interrupted a bad mood, the 8-year-old had stumbled upon the stash. He had found the money, and Rick was going to make sure the boy never told his mother about it. "Well, Richard," Mike said softly, the danger in his voice absolute. "Looks like you picked the wrong house to hide in." 10 minutes later, the wail of police sirens finally pierced the storm. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the rain as 5 Blackwood police cruisers swarmed Sycamore Drive, effectively blocking the bikers in. A squad of officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting orders over the roar of the rain. Confronting nearly 100 outlaw bikers in a residential neighborhood was a tactical nightmare. But what they found shocked them even more. The bikers didn't run, they didn't draw weapons, they simply stood in a massive, silent perimeter around the house and the club's support truck, their hands resting visibly on their belts. Detective Arthur Higgins, a 20-year veteran of the force, pushed through the perimeter. "Mike!" he shouted, recognizing the towering club president. "What the hell is going on here? We got a call about a gang invasion." Mike stood on the porch, holding the black duffel bag. He didn't flinch at the drawn firearms. "You're late, Artie," Mike called back, "but we wrapped a present for you in the living room." Higgins cautiously entered the house, flanked by 2 officers. He found Richard Kellerman, still pinned to the floor, terrified, but alive. Higgins then looked at the snapped padlock in the kitchen and the bloody nylon rope discarded on the floor. Mike tossed the passport and one of the bundles of cash onto the kitchen counter. "He's not Rick Gable. He's Kellerman. Tied up the 8-year-old boy, threw him in the basement because the kid found his stash. The 5-year-old girl escaped out a window and ran 2 miles barefoot to our saloon." Higgins blanched, staring at the duct tape and the rope. The hostility between the police and the bikers evaporated instantly, replaced by a shared, silent disgust for the man on the floor. Higgins holstered his weapon. "Get him up," Higgins ordered his officers, his voice dripping with contempt. "Read him his rights, and make sure the cuffs are tight." As the police dragged Rick out to a cruiser, a battered Honda Civic tore past the police barricade, sliding to a halt on the wet grass. Sarah Harper burst from the driver's seat. She had been called at the diner by a neighbor who heard the commotion. She looked at the shattered door, the police, the bikers, and let out a guttural scream of pure terror. "My babies! Where are my kids?" Mike stepped out of the rain, placing a massive, calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "They're safe, Mum. They're right here." He led her to the club's heated support truck. The doors opened, and Sarah collapsed to her knees in the mud as Tommy and Lily, bundled in oversized jackets and blankets, scrambled out of the truck and into her arms. The family clung to each other, sobbing in the pouring rain, while 93 hardened bikers stood in the storm in absolute respectful silence, creating a human shield around their reunion. In the weeks that followed, the truth unspooled. Richard Kellerman was a mid-level money launderer for a regional narcotics syndicate. He had been on the run for 6 months, charming his way into Sarah's life precisely because her home was off the radar, and her long working hours gave him the perfect cover to run his operations. He was facing federal charges that would lock him away for the rest of his natural life. Sarah and her children moved out of the house on Sycamore Drive a month later. The memories were too dark to paint over, but they didn't leave Blackwood. They stayed because they found out they weren't alone. When Sarah's car broke down, Doc showed up to fix it, refusing payment. When Tommy went back to school, he didn't ride the bus. For the first month, a rotating escort of 3 roaring Harley-Davidsons followed him all the way to the drop-off line, ensuring he felt like the safest, most untouchable kid in the world. And little Lily, who had braved the storm to save her brother, was given a custom-made, tiny leather cut of her own, making her the first and only honorary member of the Steel Brotherhood. That freezing November night changed Blackwood forever. 93 bikers didn't just save a little boy, they dismantled a fugitive's empire and forged an unbreakable bond with a shattered family. Today, Tommy and Lily never walk home alone, knowing an entire brotherhood rides behind them. Sometimes, the truest heroes don't wear shining armor. They wear scuffed leather, ride loud steel, and answer the desperate call of the vulnerable. The linoleum floors of Westbridge Middle School were used to the squeak of sneakers, not the heavy, synchronized thud of 25 steel-toed boots. When the building began to vibrate with the deafening roar of V-twin engines, the bullies who had tormented a quiet 12-year-old boy were about to learn a terrifying lesson about family. 12-year-old Leo Mitchell walked the hallways of Westbridge Middle School like a ghost trying not to be seen. He was small for his age, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a quiet, watchful demeanor. In a school district nestled in a highly affluent suburb, where kids wore designer sneakers and carried the latest tech, Leo stood out for all the wrong reasons. His clothes were clean but faded, his sneakers were scuffed, and his backpack bore the heavy, stitched repairs of a father doing his absolute best. Leo's father, Dylan Mitchell, was a single parent. After Leo's mother passed away from a sudden illness when Leo was just 4, Dylan's entire world had shrunk down to the boy. To the suburban parents of Westbridge, Dylan was a rough, imposing figure they preferred to ignore. Standing 6'2", with a thick beard and arms completely covered in intricate tattoos, Dylan didn't look like the other dads who drove European SUVs to the school drop-off zone. Dylan drove a battered 2004 Ford pickup, and he worked long hours as a mechanic at a custom motorcycle shop across town. But what the PTA didn't know, what Dylan actively kept hidden to give his son a normal life, was that he wasn't just a mechanic. Dylan was a patched member and the vice president of the local Hells Angels charter. For years, Dylan had separated his two lives with a rigid, unbreakable wall. Around the club, he was respected, a man of iron will who demanded loyalty and order. But when he crossed the city limits into Westbridge, he buttoned his flannel shirts to the collar, kept his head down, and swallowed his pride at every condescending look from the local country club parents, all to ensure Leo could get a good education. Unfortunately, middle school is a predatory environment, and kids possess a sixth sense for spotting vulnerability. Enter Cameron Hayes. Cameron was the son of a prominent real estate developer. He was tall, athletic, and possessed the kind of cruel arrogance that only comes from knowing your parents can buy your way out of any consequence. Cameron had decided early in the 7th grade year that Leo was the perfect target. It started small, a shoulder check in the hallway, an accidental spilled carton of milk on Leo's lunch tray. But as the months wore on, the torment escalated. Cameron and his two shadows, boys named Tyler and Brad, made Leo's life a waking nightmare. "Hey, Mitchell," Cameron sneered one Tuesday by the lockers, blocking Leo's path to his math class. "My dad said he saw your old man's truck break down on the interstate. Does he scavenge for parts in the junkyard to feed you?" Leo gripped the straps of his backpack, his knuckles turning white. "Move, Cameron." Tyler chuckled, shoving Leo hard enough to send him slamming against the metal lockers. "Don't talk back to him, trash. Your dad probably steals those bikes he works on." Leo bit his lip, refusing to let the tears fall. He knew what his dad sacrificed for him. He knew the long nights his dad spent hunched over engine blocks just to pay the mortgage in this expensive school district. He never told Dylan about the bullying. He knew his father's temper, and he knew how hard his father worked to maintain a peaceful, respectable facade for his sake. Leo didn't want to be the reason his dad lost control, so he absorbed the abuse in silence, convincing himself that if he just kept his head down, it would eventually stop. But bullies like Cameron Hayes don't stop when you stay quiet. They only get louder. At home, Dylan noticed the subtle changes in his son. He saw the withdrawn posture, the sudden lack of appetite, the torn sleeves that Leo claimed were from tripping during gym class. "You doing okay, buddy?" Dylan asked one evening, setting down a plate of spaghetti in front of Leo. He sat across from him, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. His sharp, dark eyes studied the boy intensely. "I'm fine, Dad," Leo muttered, pushing the pasta around with his fork. Dylan reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently lifting Leo's chin. "You know you can tell me anything, right? Anyone giving you a hard time? Because I can make a phone call, or I can take a ride down to that school." "No," Leo answered, too quickly. Panic flared in his chest. "No, everything is fine. Really. Just hard math test coming up." Dylan didn't believe him for a second, but he knew pushing a 12-year-old only made them retreat further into their shell. "All right," Dylan said softly. "But remember, Leo, you're a Mitchell. We don't bow our heads for anybody. You stand your ground, and if you can't, you let me stand it for you." Leo nodded, but the dread in his stomach only tightened. The school's annual Heritage and Heroes Day was coming up on Friday. Parents were invited to the gymnasium for a massive showcase, where students presented projects on their family history and the people they looked up to most. Leo had spent 3 weeks building a detailed, foot-long model of a Harley Davidson knucklehead out of spare parts, spark plugs, and polished scrap metal his dad had brought home from the shop. His project was about his father. He didn't know it yet, but that project was going to trigger a chain of events that would shake Westbridge Middle School to its foundation. The gymnasium of Westbridge Middle School was chaotic, filled with the hum of parents mingling, teachers organizing trifold display boards, and students vibrating with nervous energy. The air smelled of floor wax and cheap coffee. Leo stood behind his folding table in the back corner of the gym. His display was simple, but meticulous. Photos of his dad covered the board. Dylan holding a baby Leo, Dylan working on a beautiful chrome engine, Dylan standing proudly in front of the garage. But the centerpiece was the motorcycle model. It was a genuine work of art, shining under the harsh fluorescent lights, a testament to hours of bonding between a father and son. Dylan had promised to be there by 2 p.m., right after his shift at the shop. He had ironed a clean button-down shirt specifically for the occasion. Across the room, Cameron Hayes was holding court. His display was a professionally printed, glossy banner showcasing his grandfather's real estate empire. Cameron's father, a man in a tailored grey suit, was busy shaking hands with Principal Higgins. Bored with the adults, Cameron caught sight of Leo in the corner and nudged Tyler and Brad. "Look at the junkyard, kid," Cameron laughed, strutting over to Leo's table with his crew in tow. Leo's stomach plummeted. He instinctively stepped in front of his table, trying to block their view. "Leave me alone, Cameron. Just go back to your presentation." Cameron ignored him, leaning over Leo's shoulder to look at the photos. "Wow. Look at all this grease. My hero. The mechanic. That's pathetic, Mitchell. Is your hero going to come change my dad's oil later?" A few parents walking by chuckled softly, assuming it was just boys teasing each other. That quiet laughter emboldened Cameron. "And what is this garbage?" Cameron reached out, grabbing the heavy, spark plug motorcycle model off the table. "Don't touch that!" Leo shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged forward to grab it back. "My dad and I made that. Put it down." Cameron held it out of reach, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You made it? Out of what? Actual trash? You know, my dad says people like yours are the reason property values go down. You're just dirty biker trash." "My dad is not trash," Leo yelled, the pent-up frustration of an entire year finally boiling over. "He's a biker, and he's twice the man your stuck-up dad will ever be. Give it back." Leo shoved Cameron in the chest. It wasn't a hard shove, but Cameron, playing to the crowd, stumbled backward and let out an exaggerated cry. As he stumbled, he deliberately dropped the metal motorcycle. It hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crunch. Welds snapped, polished spark plugs shattered, and the carefully crafted wheels bent out of shape. The beautiful model shattered into a dozen pieces. The gym went dead silent. Leo dropped to his knees, staring at the ruined metal. Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled down his cheeks. Principal Higgins rushed over, followed closely by Cameron's father. What is the meaning of this? Higgins demanded. He attacked me. Cameron lied instantly, pointing a finger at Leo. I was just looking at his project and he shoved me. He's crazy. Cameron's father puffed out his chest. Principal Higgins, I will not have my son assaulted by some delinquent. He looked down his nose at Leo, who was still on his knees, gathering the broken pieces of his project. Leo, Principal Higgins said sternly, eager to placate his wealthy donor. My office. Right now. This behavior is entirely unacceptable. Nobody asked Leo what happened. Nobody asked why his project was in pieces on the floor. Cameron smirked from behind his father's arm. 10 minutes later, Dylan Mitchell walked through the double doors of the school. He was clean, his hair pulled back, holding a small camera. He walked into the gym, searching for his son's face, but found an empty table and a broken spark plug lying on the floor. When Dylan was directed to the principal's office, he walked in to find Leo sitting in a hard plastic chair, his eyes red, holding a cardboard box filled with the shattered remains of their project. Mr. Mitchell, Principal Higgins said from behind his large mahogany desk. Your son has engaged in an unprovoked physical altercation with another student. Given the circumstances of your family, I had hoped Leo would know better than to resort to violence. Dylan didn't look at the principal. He knelt down in front of Leo, his large frame blocking out the rest of the room. He looked at the box. He looked at the tear stains on his son's face. Who did this, Leo? Dylan asked. His voice was incredibly quiet, completely devoid of the anger Higgins had expected. It was a terrifying, freezing calm. Leo sniffled. Cameron Hayes. He said we were dirty biker trash, Dad. He dropped our bike. Dylan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the quiet father trying to blend into the suburbs was gone. The vice president of the Hells Angels had arrived. Dylan stood up slowly, turning his dark gaze to Principal Higgins. Who is Cameron Hayes? Now, Mr. Mitchell, let's not make this worse, Higgins stammered, intimidated by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Cameron is a good boy. His father is a very important man in this town. It was just a misunderstanding, but Leo cannot go around shoving people. Did he break my son's project? Dylan asked, his voice low and vibrating with menace. Well, it fell. Did he break it? Higgins swallowed hard. Yes, but Mr. Mitchell, you must understand. I understand everything perfectly, Dylan interrupted, picking up the box of broken parts. He handed it gently to Leo. Come on, kid, we're going home. Mr. Mitchell, Leo has detention for a week, Higgins called out, as Dylan led his son to the door. Dylan stopped, looking back over his shoulder. My son isn't serving a minute of detention, and you can tell Cameron Hayes and his very important father that I'll be having a word with them on Monday morning. Enjoy your weekend, Principal. The ride home was silent. When they got to the house, Dylan made Leo a hot cup of tea and sat with him at the kitchen table. He listened, truly listened, as Leo finally broke down and poured out every detail of the last 8 months. The locker shoving, the cafeteria taunts, the cruel jokes about their lack of money, the constant belittling of Dylan. With every word, Dylan's heart broke for his son, and a cold, calculated fury settled in his chest. He had played by their rules. He had hidden his cuts and bruises, covered his patches, and smiled at people who looked at him like he was a stray dog, all to give Leo a peaceful life. And in return, they had allowed a rich bully to torture his boy and destroy the one thing Leo was proud of. Civilian rules had failed. It was time for a different approach. Later that night, after Leo had gone to sleep, Dylan walked out to his garage. He flipped on the overhead fluorescent lights, illuminating his pride and joy. A custom, jet-black, Harley Davidson road glide. Hanging on the wall behind it was his leather cut, the infamous Hell's Angels Death's Head logo, staring out from the back, bordered by his top rocker and the Vice President patch on the front. Dylan pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number he had known by heart for 20 years. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, Bear. It's Dylan," he said, speaking to Silas Bear Montgomery, the president of the charter. "Brother," Bear replied, the gruffness instantly warming. "What's going on? You ain't called me this late since the Oakland run in 15? Dylan stared at his leather vest. "I need a favor, Bear. A big one. It's about my boy." "Leo?" Bear's tone shifted immediately, instantly protective. To the club, Leo wasn't just Dylan's kid. He was club family. "Who touched him?" "Some rich kid at his school. Been bullying him for almost a year. Broke a project he built for class today. The school is covering for the bully because the dad writes big checks." Dylan took a deep breath. "The kid told Leo we were just dirty biker trash." Silence stretched over the phone line for 5 long seconds. When Bear finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Dirty biker trash, huh?" Bear rumbled. "Well, I think it's about time Westbridge Middle School got a real education on what a biker is." "I don't want anybody getting hurt, Bear. No violence. We're not catching charges over a middle schooler," Dylan warned firmly. "I just want to make a point. I want to show my son he's got a family that stands behind him." "I hear you, brother." "Loud and clear," Bear said. "We don't need to throw a single punch. Sometimes presence is enough. Monday morning, right?" "Monday morning. Drop-off is at 8 a.m. "All right," Bear said. "I'll make some calls. I'll get Dutch, Jax, Iron Mike, and the rest of the crew. Hell, I'll call the North Side Chapter 2. Monday morning, brother. Westbridge isn't going to know what hit it." Dylan hung up the phone. He reached out and ran his hand over the worn leather of his cut. For the first time in years, he wasn't going to hide who he was. Monday was going to be a reckoning. Standing near the main entrance, holding a steaming travel mug, was Principal Higgins. Beside him stood Richard Hayes, Cameron's father, wearing a navy blue pinstripe suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Cameron was beside him, looking smug, high-fiving Tyler and Brad as they recounted the events of Friday afternoon. "I appreciate you handling that little situation so discreetly, Higgins," Richard said, checking his Rolex. "Cameron shouldn't be subjected to the emotional outbursts of the lower tax brackets. The boy simply tripped, and that kid went completely feral." "Of course, Mr. Hayes," Higgins simpered, eager to please the man who funded the school's new science wing. "Leo Mitchell will be serving detention all week. We maintain a zero-tolerance policy for violence." At 7:52 a.m., the crossing guard blew her whistle, but the sound was strangely muted. It started as a low, physical vibration. It wasn't something you heard at first. It was something you felt in the soles of your shoes. The polished asphalt of the driveway seemed to hum. Mothers paused mid-sentence. Fathers lowered their cell phones, frowning in confusion. The vibration steadily grew into a deep, guttural rumble, a synchronized mechanical heartbeat that echoed off the brick walls of the school. Then they turned the corner. Leading the pack was Dylan Mitchell, but he was no longer the quiet, unassuming dad in the faded flannel shirt. He rode a massive, custom-built, jet-black Harley Davidson road glide. The chrome gleamed menacingly under the morning sun. He wore heavy riding boots, faded denim, and, most shockingly to the Westbridge parents, his heavy leather cut. The iconic, winged death's head of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was emblazoned proudly on his back, the Vice President rocker clearly visible on the front. But Dylan wasn't alone. Behind him, riding in a tight, disciplined, staggered formation, were 24 fully patched members of the Hells Angels. It was a rolling wall of American steel and thunder. There was Bear, the towering president, riding a vintage panhead with custom ape-hanger handlebars, Dutch, the sharp-eyed sergeant-at-arms, Iron Mike, a giant of a man with a beard down to his chest, and Jax, the road captain, tightly controlling the group's pace. The roar of 25 V-twin engines echoing in the enclosed drop-off zone was deafening, a physical force that pressed against the chests of everyone standing on the sidewalk. Riding right behind Dylan, sitting proudly on the passenger pillion, was Leo. He wasn't hiding his face. He was wearing a custom-fitted, miniature leather vest over his hoodie, his arms wrapped tightly around his father's waist. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, his fear completely replaced by the overwhelming, undeniable presence of his extended family. The wealthy parents of Westbridge practically trampled each other, trying to pull their children back onto the grass. Some mothers gasped. A few fathers instinctively reached for their phones to call the police, their fingers trembling. To them, the Hells Angels were a myth, a scary story from the news, reminiscent of the wild, untamed days of historical club figures like Sonny Barger. Now that untamed world was idling right in their children's drop-off zone. Cameron Hayes dropped his backpack. The smug smirk melted off his face, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed terror. He looked at the massive men covered in tattoos and leather, and then he looked at Leo, the boy he had called Trash, sitting comfortably amidst the thunder. With military precision, Dylan cut his engine. In perfect unison, 24 other engines snapped off. The sudden, ringing silence that followed was somehow more intimidating than the roar. 25 kickstands hit the pavement with a synchronized clack. Dylan dismounted smoothly and helped Leo off the bike. Bear, Iron Mike, and Dutch stepped off their machines, flanking Dylan. The rest of the club formed a loose, impenetrable semicircle behind them, their arms crossed, their faces completely unreadable behind dark sunglasses. They didn't shout. They didn't make threats. They just stood there, exuding a quiet, terrifying authority. "Walk with me, son," Dylan said softly to Leo. With 24 Hells Angels at his back, Dylan took Leo by the hand and walked straight up the concrete path toward the school entrance. The crowd of parents parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against the brick walls to give the bikers a wide berth. Principal Higgins was frozen in place, coffee dripping down his wrist from where he had crushed his paper cup. Richard Hayes puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his alpha male facade, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed him. Dylan stopped 3 feet away from them. Bear stepped up to Dylan's right, completely blocking out the sun. "Mr. Mitchell," Higgins stammered, his voice an octave higher than usual. What is the meaning of this? You cannot bring a motorcycle gang onto school property." "It's a motorcycle club, Principal," Dylan corrected, his voice calm, level, and utterly commanding. "And I'm just a father dropping his son off for school. I brought some of my brothers along to ensure he got here safely. We hear there's a bullying problem at Westbridge that the administration is unable or unwilling to handle." Richard Hayes took a step forward, trying to salvage his pride. "Listen here, pal. You can't just roll up here with these thugs and intimidate people. I'll have the police here in 2 minutes." Bear chuckled. It was a deep, rumbling sound that made Hayes flinch. "Call 'em," Bear said, his gravelly voice carrying over the silent crowd. "We're parked in legal spots. Engines are off. We ain't breaking a single law, but we are here to have a conversation about respect." Dylan locked eyes with Richard. "Your boy," Dylan said, pointing a heavy, leather-clawed finger at Cameron, who was currently trying to hide behind Tyler. "Your boy put his hands on my son. He destroyed a project my son and I built together. And he did it because he thinks our lack of a mansion makes us trash." Dylan took one step closer to Richard. The real estate mogul instinctively took a step back. "I work 60 hours a week building engines, so my kid can go to this school and get a better education than I did. I bleed for my son. I kept my club life separate because I didn't want him judged by the prejudices of people like you. But Friday, you taught him that no matter how polite he is, bullies with money will always try to break him." "It was a misunderstanding," Richard argued, sweating profusely. "Boys will be boys." "No," a sharp, educated voice cut through the tension. Dutch, the sergeant-at-arms, stepped forward. He unzipped his leather cut slightly, reached into his inner pocket, and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. To the absolute shock of everyone present, Dutch didn't sound like a street enforcer. He sounded like a boardroom executive. "My name is Arthur Vandenberg," Dutch said clearly. "I am the retained legal counsel for this charter, and a senior partner at Vandenberg and Sterling in the city. You might recognize the firm, Mr. Hayes. We beat your company in that zoning lawsuit last quarter." Richard Hayes's jaw practically unhinged. This biker was one of the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the state. Dutch handed the paper to a shaking Principal Higgins. "This is a formal cease and desist regarding the harassment of Leo Mitchell. Furthermore, it serves as a notice of intent to sue Westbridge Middle School, the school district, and the administration for gross negligence, failure to enforce anti-bullying protocols, and emotional distress. We have a detailed log of every incident Cameron Hayes has perpetrated over the last 8 months. If Leo is so much as looked at incorrectly again, we will bankrupt this district." Higgins looked at the paper as if it were a live grenade. Dylan knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with a terrified Cameron Hayes. The boy was shaking like a leaf. "Look at me, Cameron," Dylan said firmly, but without malice. Cameron slowly raised his eyes. "You think being a man is about what your dad can buy you. It's not. Being a man is about standing by your word, protecting those who are weaker than you, and respecting people regardless of what they wear. You broke my son's property. Now you're going to apologize." Cameron looked at his father, but Richard Hayes was currently being stared down by Bear and Dutch, completely neutralized. Cameron looked back at Dylan, tears welling in his eyes. I'm sorry," Cameron choked out. "Don't apologize to me," Dylan said, pointing to Leo. "Apologize to him." Cameron turned to Leo. The boy who had tormented him for a year looked incredibly small under the shadow of the bikers. "I'm sorry, Leo. I shouldn't have broken your motorcycle. I won't bother you ever again." Leo looked at Cameron, then looked up at his dad, and then back at the sea of leather and denim behind him. For the first time in his life, Leo realized he held the power, but unlike Cameron, he chose not to abuse it. "Okay," Leo said clearly. "Just leave me alone." Dylan stood up, placing a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. He looked back at Higgins. "We clear, Principal?" "Crystal clear, Mr. Mitchell," Higgins stammered, clutching the legal document to his chest. "Good." Dylan turned to his club brothers. "Let's ride, gentlemen." The 24 Hells Angels nodded in unison. They didn't gloat. They didn't cheer. They simply turned around, their boots thudding against the pavement, and walked back to their machines. "Have a good day at school, buddy," Dylan said, pulling Leo into a tight hug. "You hold your head up. You're a Mitchell, and you have a whole army behind you." "I know, Dad." Leo smiled, the burden of the last year entirely lifted from his shoulders. "Love you." "Love you too, kid." Dylan walked back to his road glide. Within seconds, 25 engines roared back to life. the thunder returning to the suburbs. As they pulled out of the drop-off zone in a flawless, staggered formation, leaving the affluent parents coughing in a cloud of exhaust and awe, the hierarchy of Westbridge Middle School changed forever. The bullying stopped entirely that day. Cameron Hayes transferred to a private academy the following semester. As for Leo, he walked the halls with a new posture. He didn't need to fight, and he didn't need to brag. Everyone knew that behind the quiet kid with the scuffed sneakers was an unbreakable brotherhood, a father's fierce love, and a thunder that could shake the very foundations of their world. In the end, the roaring engines faded, but the lesson remained permanently etched into the halls of Westbridge. Bullying thrives in silence and complicity, but it shatters when confronted with unyielding solidarity. Leo never walked those halls with his head down again. He learned that true strength isn't about wealth or status. It's about the people who will ride through the storm to stand by your side.